Hello, I am Monica Reinagel, and you are listening to the Nutrition Diva podcast, a show where we dig into the latest nutrition research, headlines, trends, and fads so that you can make more informed decisions about what you eat. If you have irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, or you know somebody who does, then you're probably already familiar with the low-FODMAP diet. For the past decade or so, it's been considered to be pretty much the gold standard dietary approach for managing those distressing IBS symptoms like abdominal pain, bloating, diarrhea, and/or constipation, because some people alternate between the two. And while it can be very effective in managing these symptoms, the low FODMAP approach can also be challenging to implement and maintain. But some new research that was just published in the journal Nutrients suggests there might be a simpler path to relief, one that could be just as effective while being considerably easier to implement and maintain. But before we talk about this promising new alternative approach, let's quickly review what the low FODMAP diet is and why it works. So FODMAP is an acronym that stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. It's a mouthful, right? And these are specific types of carbohydrates that may be poorly absorbed in the small intestine. And when those unabsorbed carbs reach the large intestine, the beneficial bacteria that live in your gut go to work, fermenting these carbohydrates and producing a lot of gas in the process. They also tend to draw water into the intestine through osmosis. And for IBS sufferers who often have heightened sensitivity to intestinal pressure and distension, this combination of gas and fluid is what can trigger those painful symptoms. So the low FODMAP diet works by limiting foods that are high in these 6 different types of fermentable carbs. But here's where it gets tricky. FODMAPs are found in a wide variety of otherwise healthy foods, including many fruits, vegetables, grains, and dairy products. Following a low FODMAP diet means avoiding or eliminating things like wheat, rye, and other grains, onions, and garlic, many fruits, including apples and pears, dairy products, legumes like beans and lentils, and many sugar alcohols, which are commonly used in sugar-free products. Not only is the list of foods to avoid quite extensive, but the diet is typically implemented in phases. There's an initial elimination phase that lasts anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, followed by a systematic reintroduction phase where you test your tolerance to those different FODMAP groups. And the goal is to eventually customize the diet to your individual tolerances. While this very systematic approach can be effective, it requires significant education, planning, and a real commitment. And many people find it difficult to maintain, especially in social situations or when they're eating away from home. And it can also be nutritionally challenging if you're not planning it well because it eliminates so many nutrient-rich foods. So this brings us to this latest research suggesting that there might be a simpler solution. That simpler solution is called SSRD, which stands for Starch and Sucrose Reduced Diet. And while that may sound similar to a low-carb diet, it's actually more targeted. So instead of restricting all carbohydrates, it focuses specifically on reducing 2 types in particular: starch, which is found in foods like bread, pasta, and potatoes, and sucrose. That's the kind of sugar that is added to foods. Now, I will grant you that these are 2 pretty big categories of foods, but it is still a bit simpler than trying to keep track of all 6 of the FODMAPs. The idea behind this approach stems from recent discoveries about IBS. So it turns out that some IBS sufferers may have variations in genes that produce certain digestive enzymes, particularly one called sucrase isomaltase. This enzyme's job is to break down sucrose and some starches in your small intestine. And if you're not producing enough of it, those carbohydrates don't get properly digested and absorbed. Just like with the FODMAPs, These poorly digested carbs can end up causing trouble further down in your digestive system, drawing in water, getting fermented by bacteria, and leading to those all too familiar IBS symptoms. But here's where the SSRD approach differs from low FODMAP. Instead of restricting all the different types of fermentable carbs and then slowly testing each group to see which ones you can tolerate, you simply reduce your intake of starch and table sugar. That means limiting bread, pasta, rice, and potatoes, and increasing protein and healthy fats to help you feel more satisfied, and also avoiding added sugar and sugary foods. So you can still eat many of the foods that would be restricted on a low FODMAP diet, such as legumes and dairy products. And unlike the low FODMAP diet, there's no complex reintroduction phase to navigate. But the big question is, could something this simple really work as well as the more comprehensive low FODMAP approach? Well, that's exactly what researchers in Sweden set out to discover. Researchers recruited 155 IBS patients and randomly assigned them to follow either the SSRD diet or a low FODMAP diet for 4 weeks. And then they followed up with the participants 5 months later to see how they were doing. And here's what they found. After 4 weeks, both diets were equally effective. About 80% of patients reported significant improvement in their symptoms. About a quarter of them were completely symptom-free at the end of the 4 weeks. And both groups also saw similar improvements in various symptoms beyond digestive issues, such as fatigue, headaches, back pain, and other physical complaints. Both groups also reported a reduction in sugar cravings, but this effect was more pronounced in the SSRD group. Of the subjects that had some experience with both approaches, they tended to prefer the SSRD diet to the low FODMAP diet by a margin of about 2-1, reporting that it was easier to follow and for some of them more effective. As I said, the researchers also followed up with the subjects several months later to see how they were doing. So about 6 in 10 of those who were on the SSRD diet were still following that approach, although perhaps not quite as strictly. Meanwhile, only about 4 in 10 of those on the low FODMAP diet were still following that regimen, which again suggests that the SSRD was a little easier to stick with. Interestingly, though, even those who had largely reverted to their previous eating habits still reported a reduction in symptoms 6 months later. And to me, this suggests that even a brief dietary intervention to reduce symptoms can have lasting benefits, but it may also be that the study period made it easier for subjects to identify which foods were particularly problematic for them, and that they continued to avoid those foods even when they weren't following the entire dietary protocol. Aside from being effective in managing IBS symptoms, the SSRD diet may have a positive effect on other aspects of diet that really have nothing to do with IBS, such as weight management and cardiovascular health. So what does all this mean if you're struggling with IBS symptoms? Well, first, it's just encouraging to know that you may have options. While the low FODMAP diet remains a proven approach, this research suggests that this simpler strategy might work just as well, for some people anyway, as well as being more sustainable. So if you're interested in trying this approach, the official SSRD study protocol allowed 1 serving per day of whole grain bread or oatmeal porridge, plus 1 serving per day of a fiber-rich rice or pasta alternative, unrestricted intake of meat, fish, eggs, and natural dairy products, a wide variety of non-starchy fruits and vegetables, and the use of butter and oil along with salt, pepper, and fresh herbs. But what's particularly interesting is how participants ultimately simplified the SSRD approach. According to the study, many found that they could maintain their improvement by focusing on just 2 key principles: avoiding added sugar and limiting their intake of bread, potatoes, rice, and pasta. Now, of course, everyone's IBS is a little different, and what works for one person may not work for another. But given that this approach is relatively simple to implement and appears to have benefits beyond just symptom relief, it might be worth discussing with your healthcare provider as a first-line strategy, especially if you found the low FODMAP diet to be just too challenging or too complicated to follow. So I will include a link to the study in the show notes for your reference. And if you have a question about today's episode or a suggestion for a topic you'd like me to cover in a future episode, you can email me at nutrition@quickanddirtytips.com. You can also leave me a voicemail at 443-961-6206. If you're looking for more support for healthy weight management, please check out the tools and resources at wayless.life, where I help people create the habits, mindset, and lifestyle that help them weigh less without dieting. That's at wayless.life. Nutrition Diva is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. Our team includes Brandon Getchis, Nathan Sems, Davina Tomlin, Holly Hutchings, Morgan Christensen, and Nate Hoops. Thanks to all of them, and thanks to you for listening.